Are you a buyer looking to make an offer on a property, or perhaps a seller looking to know how much your house is worth? There are at least 20 different variables that come in play, and today we will talk about exactly how to look at comparables and how to adjust your price based on these different variables. Here we go. Let's start with stratified properties first. So that would be your condos and townhouses. The first variable is if it is a wood frame building versus a concrete building. Typically, a wood frame building is anywhere from $100 to $200 per square feet lower than the concrete building. So say an 800 square feet condo would be typical, let's say $1,000 per square feet would be $800,000, and a concrete building, the same exact square feet, 800 square feet, would be anywhere from 880,000 to like 950, 960,000. So it could be a pretty big difference between the pricing of a wood frame versus a concrete building. The second factor would be amenities. Say you're comparing apples to apples, so the same exact square feet, same exact developer, similar sort of buildings. If one building has some amenities like a pool or a rooftop patio or something, it's typically priced higher than the one that does not. Very obvious, but how much more? That depends. If it's, let's say, just a gym, most buildings have a gym. Even the smaller, low-rise wood frame buildings nowadays have a gym as well. So even depends on the size of the gym as well. But I would personally add anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 more for a typical condo which has a gym. EV parking, similar, $5,000-$6,000 more. A pool is a big one. I would personally add at least $25,000 if a building has a pool versus the one that does not. And a rooftop patio, similar, $20,000-$25,000 more. The next one's floor number. So the higher you go, typically the more expensive it's going to get. There's one exception. The first floor typically is more expensive than the second floor, and everything else is typically more expensive than the second. So the third, fourth, more expensive, fifth, more expensive, sixth, even more. But the first one's a little expensive just because it typically has some sort of an outdoor space, usually a patio, which the second floor does not. The second floor just has a balcony, but the higher you go, of course, the view gets better. So typically, then it starts going up in price. How much? Anywhere from $3,000 per floor to $6,000 per floor. Depends if it's a wood frame or a concrete building, depends on the location and depends on the view as well. The next one's the outdoor space. So let's say you have a 100 square feet balcony and another building has a 150 square feet balcony. That doesn't really matter. It's not a huge difference, so you can typically maybe pay like a couple $1,000s more, but at the end of the day, whatever you can price whatever you want, it's not a big difference. But if you have a 100 square feet balcony versus a 500 square feet balcony, that's a pretty big difference. I would personally pay for a bigger balcony or patio at least $15,000 to $25,000 more. Compared again, the inside is the same exact age, same everything, but just the balcony, if it's a 400 or 500 square feet bigger, that's like $25,000 more. The next one's proactiveness of a strata. There's a lot of things that go in a building. Typically roof, windows, parking membrane, balconies. There's a lot of things like elevators and many things that a strata needs to replace over time. There's of course life expectancy of everything. How much more should you pay for a building that has done a lot of things versus a building that has just delayed and not really done anything? Depends. There's a lot of meeting minutes. You have to look at engineering reports, depreciation reports, and all the past 2 years of strata minutes, and then you can make an educated guess of how much more should a building which has done all the maintenance is worth. The next one's strata fees. So your strata fees could typically be anywhere from 0.25 mostly for townhouses to anywhere from 0.5 to 0.6 for wood frame or high-rise buildings, depending on the number of units and depending on how many things there are in the building. Like if there's a pool, usually it's you have to pay higher strata fees. So typically, of course, the building which has a lower strata fee, they tend to sell quicker than the ones that have a higher strata fees. But this is not just a guaranteed thing. Of course, depends if the building which has a lot of amenities, it tends to have a higher strata fees. So it's not a guaranteed thing that just because one building has lower strata fees, it should sell for more. But that's what usually happens. Again, there's some exceptions, but usually if one building has, let's say, $100 per month lower strata feet than the next building, which is the same exact unit, same exact everything, then just based on the supply and demand, just because the building with the lower strata fees will have more demand, more number of buyers, that will sell quicker, could get a higher price. It is what it is. The next factor is a corner unit. So an inside unit versus a corner unit, there's typically anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 price difference. That's solely based on the sunlight. So let's say if there's a unit in a high-rise building and it's between two units, it's not a corner unit, you can only face one direction, and depending on which direction it faces, it could be like super gloomy. There might not be sun at all in that unit. But if it's a corner unit, typically at least there will be some sort of sunlight, and it will be a lot more brighter than the one that is not a corner unit. So again, it's anywhere from $20,000 to like $40,000 depending on many factors, but that's the typical price for a corner versus an inside unit. The next one's location. So the closer you are to the city core, typically you could expect more price than a house 50 kilometers away. There's always exceptions. There's always some very highly sought after areas very far away from the cities as well. But generally, the closer you are to the city core, the more expensive the area is. Of course, Point Grey, Kitsilano, Shaughnessy, those are one of the most prime locations. So of course, a property there will be a lot more expensive than 50 kilometers away from those neighborhoods. So the closer you are to the city core, the more expensive it generally is. The next one's age of the home. So let's say a typical 1970s house versus a 1980s built house. If the square feet is the same, just because the way 1980s houses were built, they're usually, even the outside structure looks much better than the 70s. You can typically expect to pay $50,000-$60,000 more for a decade difference. Similar for 80s and 90s. 90s are usually the ones with like big pillars out in the front, so you can again expect to pay like 50, 60, 70,000 more for those. The next one's lot size. So the closer you are to the big city, let's say Vancouver, even 100 square foot could make a significant difference. A 4,000 square foot lot versus a 4,100 square foot lot, there could be a fairly significant price difference, just because per square feet wise in the core city of Vancouver, it's a pretty big number, anywhere from $1,400 to like $2,000 per square feet, right? But the further away you go, let's say Surrey, Langley, 100 square feet won't really make a big difference. That's almost the same exact price. But if it's 1,000 square feet, then yes, you can expect to pay even like $100,000 more, depending on the many factors. The next one's lot shape. So most favorable lot shape is a perfectly flat rectangular lot. A cul-de-sac lot, let's say, or also called a pie-shaped lot, is much less desirable than a rectangular lot. What's the price difference? Many factors, many variables, depends. Every buyer, every seller looks at this differently. But just from my past many years of experience, I can tell you, let's say out in Surrey, 7,000 square foot rectangular lot versus 7,000 square foot a pie-shaped lot with, let's say, only like a small 33 feet frontage. So a 60 foot frontage versus 33 feet frontage, I would personally pay at least $60,000 less if it's a pie-shaped lot. Every person has their own numbers. Some people won't even buy if it's not a rectangular lot with at least, let's say, 50-60 foot frontage. And so just based on the sole supply and demand equation, there's at least a $60,000-$70,000 difference between a cul-de-sac versus a rectangular lot. The next one's the house size. So for a condo, a townhouse, per square feet is a pretty big deal, just because the size is so small. So every single square foot makes a dent. So in condos, let's say it's like $1,000, $1,200 per square feet. For detached houses, it's not as big of a deal. Of course, it's important, it's very important, but we cannot price it based on per square feet. We can still make an educated guess. We can still, we have to pay more for a bigger house. Typically, let's say if it's a 2,000 square feet versus a 2,500 square feet house, I would personally pay at least $60,000 to $80,000 more for something like 500 square feet. So depends, of course, it depends on location as well. If it's like right in the city of Vancouver, it's a lot more expensive. If it's like out in Langley, Chilliwack, Abbotsford, it's not as high of a difference, but of course there's still a difference, but not like $70,000 difference, maybe like $30,000-$40,000 difference. So depending on where it is, depending on how big, of the size we're looking, of the how big the difference is, anywhere from like $200 to like $400 per square feet would be good enough for a suburb detached house. Next one's number of bedrooms and bathrooms. Of course, there's many variables, but you probably don't want to hear it depends. You probably want to know some sort of a rough average. I would personally pay $5,000 to $10,000 more for a bedroom, or a $15,000 to $20,000 more for a bathroom, as long as we're again comparing apples to apples. The square feet is the same. There's an additional bathroom in one of the house. $15,000 to $20,000 more at least. The next one's mortgage helper. So if a house has a suite versus a house that does not have a suite, as long as the square feet is the same, I would personally pay at least $70,000 to $100,000 more for a house that has a mortgage helper. Depends, of course, depends on location. That's very important. In some locations, let's say Point Grey in Vancouver, a suite doesn't really do anything. But if it's in the suburbs, in Maple Ridge, Langley, Surrey, anywhere south of the Fraser River, a suite adds at least $70,000, if not more, to the price. And the next factor is condition of the home. Kind of obvious, but let's say there's a house that has no renovations at all. It's a 1980s built old house, and a house that has same exact house, same exact everything, just the flooring has been done. Barely any difference. Doesn't really do much of a price difference for these two houses. But if there's an original house versus a fully renovated house, many factors depends on how much the seller has spent on the renovations. You can pretty much expect to add at least that number, and usually add like 50%, because that's how it generally works. You spend money in cash, and then you don't have to spend the money as a buyer in cash. You can get a mortgage. You only have to pay, let's say, 20% of whatever the money that has been spent on renovations. So of course there's a price that you have to pay to not have to pay the money in cash. Typically 150% or up to double the price of whatever the renovation cost. Or the next one's the view or the direction the house is facing. If a house is facing a cemetery or a very let's say power lines, that's not a good site. So I would personally pay at least $50,000 less for the same exact house that does not face any weird things. If the backyard is, let's say, south facing backyard and there's a lot of sun, that's also a very important thing to a lot of people. So a house with a backyard, south facing backyard, typically sells for $20,000-$30,000 more than a house that does not get a lot of sun. The next one's busy street versus a quiet street. Depending on how busy the street is, I could personally see myself paying at least $70,000 to $100,000 less for a busy street. Let's say if it's King George Boulevard in Surrey, that's very busy. But if it's, let's say, only 124th Street, that's not as busy. So you can expect to pay a little lesser, let's say $70,000 price difference for lesser, busier street, and $100,000 price difference for a very busy street. Similar in Vancouver, 9th Street is probably the busiest, and the other smaller ones are not as busy. And the next factor is the slope of the house. Let's say if it's a perfectly flat lot versus a house which is like super hilly from north to south, let's say there's a 30-degree angle, or let's say there's at least 10 feet difference that in height from like one end to the other, you can expect to pay at least anywhere from $30,000 to like upwards of like hundreds of $1,000s, depending on how, what the grading is. And another factor is schools. Most public schools are almost the same. Like 99% of them have the same education, similar teachers, same everything. But there are some schools which are like super desirable. So even if it's The next block, which does not have the same catchment as, let's say, one house in that school's catchment, you can expect to pay like $50,000 or $100,000 less, depending on how desirable the school is and how many buyers actually want to put their kids in the school. And the next really, really important factor is zoning or development potential. Let's say you're comparing one house to another house, that there could be hundreds of thousands of dollars of difference just based on what you can build on one lot versus the other. Only an experienced realtor can probably tell you what the exact price difference is, but let's say if it's one of the worst zonings in, let's say, the Fraser Valley, it's like CD zoning. That's where you can only build like a 2,600 square foot house on a standard 7,000-8,000 square foot lot, versus an RF, like standard zoning. You can typically expect to pay like $50,000 to $100,000 more for a normal zoning. But if it's a townhouse zoning, then you can expect another $100,000 more. If it's apartment zoning, again, there's no one size fits all answer. It's not just $100,000. It depends on exactly how big the lot is, exactly how many units you can put on one lot versus other. So only an experienced realtor can probably tell you exactly what the price difference is, and not every realtor knows the development potentials. So work with someone who does this for a living, who does developments, who helps clients who are developers. Okay, moving on to problems. Let's say one house, same lot, another house, same lot. There could be a $50,000 to $100,000 difference just based on some problems in one house. Problems are easements, right of ways, creeks, power lines, T-intersection, or it could be a grow-up house versus a non-grow-up house. That's like $100,000 difference, or potentially more, depending on exactly what or how big the problem is. Moving on, next one's back lanes. In Vancouver, back lanes are super important. You can typically expect to pay at least $150,000 to even $200,000 less if a house does not have a back lane. In Maple Ridge, Surrey, that's not as big of a price difference, but you can still, if a house has, that's a very big premium. If let's say a house has a back lane, let's say Surrey, not $150,000 difference, but at least $50,000 difference. And the final factor is land assembly. So let's say you're looking at a comparable that's sold for $2 million. Is your house worth $2 million? Probably not, if that house that was sold as a land assembly package deal for, let's say, the entire block. A developer can buy the entire development land assembly and make like a high-rise building. On one lot, a developer can't really do a lot, even if it is in the, let's say, the townhouse zoning. If it's just a standard 6,000-7,000 square foot lot, even if it's in the townhouse zoning, that's not really a huge premium. Of course, if you can get your neighbors involved and get a land assembly together, then yes, you could get the couple $1 million, depending on exactly what you can build. But if it's not a land assembly, then it depends. There's no one answer, but anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000 is the price difference for a land assembly lot versus a standalone normal single lot. Okay, so those are most of the factors that we look at when comparing prices and coming out to like one specific price of a house just by looking at the comparable solds. One very, very, very important thing, most people are biased. Buyers are biased, and when they're looking at the comparables, they tend to overlook the premium factor, and they think the house that they're going to write an offer on should be worth lesser than the next house. Sellers, on the other hand, are biased. They tend to think their house is one of the best in the block. They tend to overlook the development factors on other lots or many other factors like the condition of the home, or if the other house has a basement suite or not. So always get an unbiased opinion. Always maybe get opinions of like 2-3 different realtors, or pay an appraiser if you would like to know the exact price that you could get in this market. But the best thing to do is get one realtor who does a lot of business, especially in your specific neighborhood, and just trust them. Of course, do your own homework. never just let anyone else dictate the price, but at least as long as they show you exactly how they came up with the price, by showing you exactly what the other sold comparables are and why they're basing your property on, compared to the other properties, it's usually okay to trust realtors. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Khush Khosa and I am your realtor, and I will see you in the next video.